The desert, in that hour just before dawn, was a monochrome wasteland of suggestion and shadow. The vast, empty bowl of the Nevada sky was still a deep, bruised violet, the stars not yet faded but hardening into icy points of light against the encroaching glow. On the horizon, the jagged teeth of the mountains were a stark, black paper cutout. The air was cold, thin, and carried the scent of sagebrush, creosote, and something else, something metallic and dry, the smell of absolute isolation. This was a place that did not exist on any public map, a place where the silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure on the eardrums. The airstrip itself was a gash in the desert floor, 3 runways of cracked and weathered asphalt laid down in a drunken triangle, surrounded by decaying hangars whose corrugated steel skins were peeling away like sunburnt flesh. One hangar, however, stood apart. It was newer, larger, its concrete walls thick and windowless, a bunker masquerading as a maintenance shed. It was from the yawning darkness of its interior that a low, electric hum began to disturb the primordial quiet. The sound was not the familiar, thunderous roar of a piston engine, nor the high-pitched whine of an early jet. This was different, a resonant, almost subsonic vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, setting teeth on edge and causing the fine dust on the ground to tremble. Slowly, impossibly quietly, a shape was towed out into the pre-dawn gloom. It was an aircraft, but like no other that had ever flown. It was a study in sharp, geometric angles, a bat-winged silhouette that seemed to drink the faint starlight rather than reflect it. Its skin was not polished aluminum, but a matte, non-reflective black that seemed to be a hole cut out of the very fabric of the night. There were no visible rivets, no seams, no national insignia, no markings of any kind. It was a ghost, given form. This was the XF-107, a designation that would be scrubbed from all official records before the sun had fully risen. To the handful of men who knew of it, it was simply the midnight bird. On the edge of the tarmac, a lone figure stood shrouded in a heavy parka, his breath pluming in the frigid air. This was General Elias Thorne, a man whose career was a living history of the shadow war that had begun before the hot one ended. He had stood on the tarmac at Roswell Inn, 47, he had overseen the interrogations at Wright-Patterson, and now he was here, in this godforsaken stretch of desert, to light the fuse on the strangest mission of them all. His face, etched with the lines of 1,000 secrets, was a granite mask, but his eyes, pale and watchful, betrayed a flicker of something that was not quite anxiety, and not quite fear, but a cold, clinical dread. He watched as the ground crew, a team of 6 men in dun-colored coveralls, moved with a practiced, silent efficiency. They were not Air Force. They were contractors from a shell corporation that traced back to a locked filing cabinet in a Pentagon sub-basement. They fueled the craft with a special, low-smoke kerosene blend, their movements economical, their eyes never meeting each other's. They knew the drill. They had practiced this ballet in the dead of night for months. When they were done, they would be escorted to a windowless room and presented with a single sheet of paper. It was not a debriefing, it was an erasure. They would sign affidavits stating that on this date, at this time, they had serviced nothing. They had seen nothing. They were, for all intents and purposes, vapor. Thorne's gaze shifted from the aircraft to the 3 figures approaching from the operations shack. They moved with the loose-limbed, economical gait of men who were more weapon than man. They were already clad in their pressure suits, silver gray and form-fitting, making them look like archaic deep-sea divers or visitors from a colder, more logical future. Their faces were obscured by tinted visors. They had no names, only call signs, and those were temporary, to be discarded upon mission completion, if such a thing occurred. The leader was Mako. He was the oldest, his calm a force of nature that could steady a crew in the face of the impossible. To his right was Stitch, the systems man, a savant who could converse with the bird's alien electronics as if they were a living thing. On Mako's left was Rook, the youngest, a pilot of such preternatural instinct he was said to fly by feel alone. They were the only ones who would board the craft. There was no room for anyone else. The midnight bird was a scalpel, not a broadsword, and its cockpit was a sealed environment, a world unto itself. They stopped before Thorne. No salutes were exchanged. Here, rank was a formality that had been left behind at the gate. The weather is clear over the primary, Thorne said, his voice a low rasp, devoid of emotion. The package is active and awaiting collection. You have your window. Mako gave a single, curt nod. The visor made him impossible to read, a mirror reflecting only Thorne's own grim countenance. We understand the parameters, sir. Do you? Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. This isn't a test flight over the Nellis Range. You're not going to the Urals. You're going elsewhere. The physics you know are suggestions where you're headed. The sky is not empty there. Do not engage. You are a whisper. You are a breath on a cold night. You must not be seen. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, heavier than the aircraft itself. Not seen by whom? Was it the Russians? Had they stumbled upon something similar? Or was it something else? something that had been here long before the first ape man picked up a rock and looked at the stars. Thorne offered no clarification. The mystery was part of the security. A man can't reveal what he doesn't know. Without another word, the three figures turned and ascended the short ladder into the belly of the midnight bird. The hatch, a perfectly fitted section of the black skin, closed behind them with a soft, pressurized hiss, sealing them in. The ladder was wheeled away. The ground crew retreated, their heads down, already becoming non-persons. Inside the cockpit, the world was bathed in the soft, phosphorescent green of cathode ray tubes and the warm orange glow of analog dials. It was cramped, a womb of switches and levers. The air smelled of ozone, warmed electronics, and their own recycled breath. Mako settled into the left seat, his hands moving over the pre-start sequence with a muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. Stitch was to his right, his fingers already dancing across a bank of custom-built oscilloscopes and frequency analyzers, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to the machine. Rook was in the engineer's station behind them, a position with its own set of controls, a redundant set of eyes and hands for the most critical phases of flight. Primary power, engaged, Mako said, his voice flat and calm through the helmet intercom. A low thrum pulsed through the airframe as banks of capacitors began to charge. Navigation grid is live, Stitch confirmed. Inertial platform is spinning up. No drift. She's clean. Environmental is green, Rook added from the back. Pressure stable. All seals confirmed. There was no radio chatter with the tower. There was no tower, not in any conventional sense. There was only a small, reinforced concrete blockhouse half a mile away, its single antenna pointed not at the sky, but at the aircraft. The only communication was a secure, line-of-sight laser link, a thread of coherent light that would be severed the moment they broke ground. Mako's hand closed around the unique, pistol grip control yoke. Igniting the primary, he flipped up a guarded switch and turned a key. The low hum that had been a background presence suddenly deepened, intensified, becoming a palpable force that vibrated up through the seats and into their bones. Behind them, in the complex heart of the aircraft, a revolutionary form of ducted fan engine, driven by a compact nuclear thermal reactor, began to spool up. There was no fiery exhaust, no roar of combustion, just a rising, resonant whine that promised velocities no other aircraft on Earth could achieve. Through the thick, curved canopy, Mako saw General Thorne take one step back, then another, his figure growing smaller, receding into the landscape of the night. "We are go for rollout," Mako said. The bird began to move, not with a lurch, but with a smooth, electric glide. It turned onto the main runway, a black shark entering a black river. At the threshold, it paused for a single, suspended moment. The desert held its breath. Mako advanced the throttle. The whine became a shriek, though it was muffled, contained by the advanced acoustical damping within the craft. The acceleration was not a brutal shove in the back, but a relentless, smooth, and terrifying push, as if a giant hand was pressing them forward. The runway lights became a seamless blur, then vanished as the desert floor fell away. They were airborne. The vibration smoothed out into a glassy, effortless hum. The blackness of the land melted into the deeper blackness of the sky. The stars above were no longer points of light, but a solid, frozen river of diamonds. It was then that Mako keyed the laser link for the one and only time. His voice was calm, a flat line of professional competence. "Outbound. We won't be using the return runway." In the blockhouse, the technician heard the words, saw the light on his panel blink out as the link was broken. He made no log entry. He simply turned and nodded to General Thorne, who stood silhouetted in the doorway. Thorne returned the nod, then turned and walked out into the growing dawn. Behind him, the mission was already being erased. The flight logs were blank. The squadron records showed no aircraft assigned. The fuel depot had no record of a disbursement. It was a hole punched in reality, and the bureaucracy was already rushing to seal it up. The midnight bird banked gently to the north, its nose tilting up, climbing not just in altitude, but into a realm of classification so profound that its very existence was a threat to the established order. It flew into the fading night, a secret carrying three ghosts, on a mission to collect an asset from a place that was not on any map, with orders to remain unseen by an enemy that had no name. They were the men without shadows, the soldiers in the negative space of official history. To understand the crew of the Midnight Bird, one must first understand the symmetry of programs that gave them birth. They were not products of the United States Air Force, not in any way that would be admitted before a congressional committee. They were the final, polished instruments of an initiative that had been born in the frantic, paranoid days of 1947, codenamed Orpheus. Orpheus was the Pentagon's answer to the unnerving, the inexplicable. Its mandate was simple, and terrifying, to weaponize the unknown. When a Navy pilot reported a glowing object that outpaced his skyray off the coast of Catalina, the report went to Orpheus. When strange, submersible craft were sonar painted moving at impossible depths off Puerto Rico, it was Orpheus that analyzed the data. And when certain biological materials, were recovered from a crash site in the New Mexican desert. It was Orpheus that established the first, clandestine research facility to study them. The men of Orpheus were a new breed. They were test pilots, yes, but also academics, linguists, theoretical physicists, and men with what the files coldly termed high psionic resilience. They were screened for loyalty, for intellect, but most of all for their ability to look into the abyss of the impossible without their sanity shattering. They were taught to fly aircraft that defied conventional aerodynamics, to operate equipment that seemed to function on principles bordering on magic, and to confront realities that would make a lesser man catatonic. Mako had been a young major, a decorated P-51 Mustang ace in the war, when he was recruited. His final interview was not in a Pentagon office, but in a sealed room at Wright-Patterson. A man in a civilian suit, who never gave his name, had shown him a series of photographs, grainy, black and white images of a crushed, metallic disc, and of something else, something that was not human, laid out on a stainless steel table. "What do you see, Major?" the man had asked, his voice devoid of inflection. Mako had looked, his stomach a cold knot, his pilot's mind fighting against the evidence of his eyes. He saw the future of warfare. He saw the end of American air superiority. He saw a puzzle. "I see a problem, sir," he had replied, his voice steady. "And I see a solution." He was in. For a decade, Orpheus operated in the deepest black-budget ether. They built prototypes. They trained crews. They developed doctrines for engaging non-terrestrial vehicles. They even, it was rumored, made contact, of a sort. But by 1954, the political winds had shifted. The cost was astronomical. The results were ambiguous. A new president, a new Secretary of Defense, demanded accountability for the rivers of money flowing into these black holes. Orpheus was deemed too risky, too esoteric, a playground for mad scientists. It was officially shuttered, its files sealed in a vault that was itself inside a larger vault, its personnel reassigned to more conventional, if still highly classified, projects. But a skeleton of the program never died. Men like General Thorne saw the closure not as an end, but as an opportunity to go even deeper underground. The very best of Orpheus, the most stable pilots, the most brilliant engineers, the most resilient minds, were quietly placed in a state of administrative limbo. Their service records were expunged. Their bank accounts were closed and their assets transferred to blind trusts. Their families were told a cover story, a training accident over international waters, a body lost at sea. A flag, neatly folded, was presented to a weeping widow. They were given new names, new social security numbers, and they entered a new, deeper layer of the clandestine world. They became the Phantoms. Mako, Stitch, and Rook were phantoms. Mako, now in his late 30s, was the old man. His real name was Michael Alderson, but that man had died in a paperwork crematorium in 1955. He had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter, Emily, who believed he had gone down with his F-94 Starfire in the North Atlantic. He had watched his own funeral from a parked car a quarter-mile away, the rain streaking the windows like tears. The grief had not destroyed him, it had been cauterized, sealed away in a mental lockbox that he only opened in the deepest, most silent watches of the night. He was the mission's rock, its conscience, and its soul. Stitch, whose real name was forgotten even by himself, was a prodigy from MIT who had been plucked from a radar development lab before he could finish his doctorate. He was a wiry, intense man with eyes that saw the world not as solid objects, but as intersecting fields of energy and probability. He had been the one to first hypothesize the resonance frequency of the non-terrestrial materials studied by Orpheus, a theory that was the entire basis for the Midnight Bird's primary sensor suite. To him, the mission was not a flight, but a symphony of data, and he was the conductor. Rook was the wild card, a farm boy from Kansas with an intuitive, almost supernatural understanding of aerodynamics. He had been flying crop dusters at 14. The Air Force had discovered him setting impossible low-level speed records in an F-86 Sabre over Korea, weaving through valleys where no one else dared fly. He was all instinct, a creature of the air. He had no family to mourn him. The sky was his only home. He was the mission's spirit, its raw, untamed talent. Their preparation for this flight had been unlike any other. There was no thick mission binder, no weeks of briefings with intelligence officers pointing at maps of Siberia. Their entire briefing had taken place 6 minutes before they suited up, in a bare, concrete-walled room lit by a single, naked bulb. General Thorne had been there, alone. He placed a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper on the metal table. On it were 3 paragraphs, typed in a large, courier font. Phase 1, proceed to primary collection zone, PCZ, via designated ingress corridor. Phase 2, activate the loom. Acquire the asset. Secure it in the primary bay. Phase 3, egress via designated corridor. Do not, under any circumstances, engage any contact, visual or otherwise. Your mission is collection, not combat. You must not be seen. That was it. No coordinates. No description of the loom or the asset. No definition of contact. The coordinates were already programmed into the bird's navigation computer. The loom was a piece of equipment Stitch had helped design, a device that used focused quantum resonance to, in theory, pull the asset from its location and into the bird's containment bay. It was physics that belonged in a journal that wouldn't be published for 50 years. As they sat in the climbing cockpit, the sprawling, dark tapestry of the American West unspooling beneath them, each man was alone with his thoughts, sealed in his own private world inside their shared, metallic womb. Mako's focus was absolute, a laser beam of concentration. His hands rested lightly on the controls, his eyes scanning the ghostly green radar screen and the array of engine gauges. He was monitoring their climb, their speed, their heading, but a part of his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of the last thing Thorne had said to him alone, just before they boarded. The return runway is a contingency we cannot afford. Success means you come back to a different world. Failure means you never existed at all. He understood now. There was no coming back to that remote airstrip. There would be no debrief. If they succeeded, they would be disappearing again, into a new identity, a new life, another layer of the onion. The mission was a one-way ticket, no matter the outcome. Stitch was in his element. His world was a constellation of dials and screens. He was monitoring the output of the reactor, the stability of the magnetic field containing the plasma core, the health of the loom. He spoke in a quiet, technical monologue, a stream of consciousness that was both a status report and a mantra. Reactor core at 98%. Field integrity is nominal. Loom capacitors charging. Resonance frequency is stable at 1.42 GHz. The background is quiet. Very quiet. This last observation gave him pause. The background was the ambient electromagnetic noise of the planet. Where they were going, the briefing materials had suggested, the background was anything but quiet. Rook, from his station in the rear, was watching the stars. With the primary systems stable, he had the luxury of looking out. The canopy offered a breathtaking, panoramic view. The sky was no longer black, but a deep, rich indigo, the first hint of a sun that was still below the curve of the earth painting the horizon with a thin line of electric blue. The stars were beginning to fade, but he could still see them, countless, cold, and distant. He wasn't thinking about the asset, or the loom, or the strange physics of their mission. He was thinking about the sheer, unadulterated joy of flight, of being at the controls of a machine that could kiss the edge of space, of the silence. It was a silence so complete it had a texture, a weight. It was the silence of the grave, or of the void between worlds. And he loved it. For nearly an hour, they flew in this manner, a silent, black arrow piercing the high stratosphere. They were far north now, over the Canadian wilderness, a vast, uninhabited expanse of glacial rock and stunted forest. The world below was a cartographer's nightmare, a land of shadows and contours. It was Stitch who broke the long silence, his voice cutting through the hum of the electronics with a new, sharp edge. Mako, I'm getting adrift. Mako's eyes flicked to his own navigation panel. The inertial guidance system, a marvel of gyroscopic stability, was the most accurate in the world. It shouldn't drift. Confirm, Mako said, his voice flat. It's not the INS, Stitch replied, his fingers flying across a keypad, calling up new data on his screens. It's everything. The geomagnetic field. It's fluctuating. Readings are off the scale. It's like we're flying near a massive, rotating magnet. But there's nothing down there. Nothing on the maps. Rook leaned forward, peering out through the canopy. The stars, he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. Look at the stars. Mako and Stitch looked up. The familiar constellations were there, but they were wrong. They seemed subtly distorted, their relative positions shifted by a few critical degrees, as if viewed through a flawed lens. And the light from them was different. It was colder, sharper, tinged with a faint, unnatural violet. We've crossed the threshold, Mako said quietly. We're in the ingress corridor. This was it, the point of no return. The place where the known laws of physics began to gently, insistently, unravel. The mission had truly begun. They were no longer just flying north. They were flying into the strange. The bird flew on, a sliver of manufactured darkness moving into a waiting, and watchful, unknown. The sky ahead was no longer just sky. It was a veil, and they were about to pass through it. The drift Stitch had detected was not a mere instrument error. It was a fundamental unraveling of the physical constants they had built their lives upon. The compass was the first to surrender completely, its needle abandoning the magnetic north to spin in a lazy, dizzying circle, as if chasing its own tail. Then the altimeters began to tell conflicting stories. The pressure altimeter insisted they were descending rapidly towards an invisible Earth, while the radar altimeter, pinging the terrain below, reported they were holding a steady 65,000 feet. The numbers on the screens became meaningless glyphs. It's not a malfunction, Stitch said, his voice tight, a scalpel of concentration cutting through the rising static in their headsets. He was no longer just monitoring systems. He was performing an autopsy on reality itself. The local spacetime is pliable. The laws of electromagnetism are different here. It's like we've flown into a bubble where the rules were written by someone else. The radios had died next, not in a crackle of interference, but with a soft, final hiss, like the last breath of a dying man. The familiar chatter of civilian air traffic, the military beacons, even the background cosmic hiss of the universe, it all vanished, replaced by an absolute, suffocating silence. They were utterly alone, cut adrift from the world of men. Rook, his face bathed in the eerie green glow from his panel, stared out at the sky. The distortion he'd noticed earlier had intensified. The stars were no longer just misaligned, they were smears of light, stretched and warped as if seen through a bottle of heated glass. The aurora borealis, which should have been a distant, shimmering curtain to the south, was here a violent, localized storm. Ribbons of neon green and sickly purple plasma snaked and coiled around the aircraft, silent and malevolent, casting a pulsating, unnatural light into the cockpit. They weren't just observing a phenomenon, they were flying through the bloodstream of a living, alien sky. The air doesn't want us here, Rook murmured, giving voice to the primal fear that was coiling in the pit of every man's stomach. It was more than a feeling, it was a palpable pressure, a resistance that went beyond wind shear or turbulence. It was as if the atmosphere itself had become a sentient, viscous fluid, pushing back against this intruder from a rational world. Mako's hands were steady on the controls, but his knuckles were white. The Midnight Bird was handling differently. The smooth, responsive feel was gone, replaced by a sluggishness, a sense that the air was thick as syrup. The revolutionary fly-by-wire system, which translated his gentle pressures on the stick into flight surface movements, was lagging, the inputs and responses separated by a perceptible, disorienting delay. He was no longer flying the aircraft, he was negotiating with the environment. Switching to manual reversion, Mako announced, his voice a low, calm anchor in the psychic storm. He flipped a series of guarded switches, bypassing the computers and connecting the control yoke directly to the hydraulic actuators. It was a brutal, physical way to fly, like steering a battleship with reins, but it was honest. He could feel the bird's struggle transmitted directly through the stick, the shudder of the wings as they fought the strange air, the vibration of the control surfaces as they bit into the resistant medium. Navigational data is corrupt, Stitch reported, tapping frantically at his screens. The inertial navigation system, their one reliable guide in this geomagnetic chaos, was now spewing gibberish. The coordinates for the primary collection zone were still in the computer, but their own position relative to it was a question mark. The INS thinks we're over the Pacific. We're blind. Mako's eyes scanned the hellish landscape outside. The aurora provided the only illumination, flashing and strobing to reveal a terrain below that was wrong. They were over the high Arctic, but this was not the featureless expanse of ice and snow depicted on charts. Through the swirling, phosphorescent mist, he could see jagged, black peaks that clawed at the sky, their shapes too sharp, too twisted to be formed by natural geology. There were no lights, no signs of life, no traces of the Soviet listening posts or the secret American weather stations that intelligence reports insisted were here. This was a place of absolute nullity, a cartographic sin, a white space on the map that was, in reality, a crushing, active void. We're not where we're supposed to be, Rook said from the back, his voice hushed. Or, we are, and the maps are wrong. For nearly an hour, they flew on, guided by nothing but Mako's instinct and the eerie, silent light show that enveloped them. The sense of disorientation was profound, a seasickness of the soul. Time itself seemed to stretch and compress. A glance at the clock would show only a minute had passed, yet it felt like an eternity of fighting the oppressive, sentient air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the resistance ceased. The Midnight Bird surged forward as if released from a giant's grip. The control stick became responsive again in Mako's hands. The warped stars snapped back into their familiar, cold configurations. The aurora vanished, leaving behind the deep, clean blackness of a normal Arctic night. The instrument panels, which had been a carnival of malfunction lights, slowly, one by one, returned to green. They had passed through the veil. Below them, under the clear, untwisted light of a billion stars, lay a circular valley, perfectly round, as if a giant cookie cutter had been pressed into the earth. It was devoid of the jagged peaks that surrounded it, a bowl of pristine, white snow that gleamed under the starlight with an almost metallic sheen. And in the dead center of this perfect circle stood the asset. Stitch was the first to see it on his scopes. I've got a return, he whispered, his voice full of awe. Massive, geometric. The loom is. It's singing. The resonance is perfect. Mako banked the bird into a wide, descending circle, giving him a panoramic view. No one spoke. The thing below defied immediate comprehension. It was not a crashed vehicle. It was not a building. It was a structure, blacker than the space between stars, are angular, non-Euclidean form that seemed to be composed of intersecting planes and sharp, impossible angles. It looked like a crystal that had been grown according to the rules of a geometry invented on another world. It was both immense and difficult to gauge in size, its proportions messing with the depth perception. Parts of it seemed buried deep in the ice and rock, suggesting an age that was geological, not historical. The snow had drifted against its base, but none clung to its slick, non-reflective surfaces. It was ancient, impossibly, terrifyingly ancient, and it hummed. The sound was not heard through the air, nor through the aircraft's skin. It was a vibration that traveled up from the very core of the planet, a deep, subsonic thrum that they felt in their bones, in their teeth, in the fillings in their molars. It was the sound of power, of immense, dormant machinery operating on a scale that dwarfed human endeavor. It was the heartbeat of the place, the source of the distortion they had flown through. This was what guarded the valley. This was what made the compasses spin and the radios die. Mako completed his circle, bringing the bird to a hover a half-mile from the structure. The silence in the cockpit was heavier than any they had experienced. The question hung unspoken between them, a specter at the feast of their understanding. What is it? Was it Soviet? The thought was laughable. The sheer, primordial age of the thing precluded it. This was not something built in a decade, or a century. This was a piece of a world that was old when the dinosaurs were young. American. Classified beyond classified. They were the keepers of the nation's deepest secrets, and this was a secret orders of magnitude deeper. This was not a secret of man. This was a secret of the earth itself, or something else. The answer was obvious, and terrifying. They were looking at something not of this world. An artifact, a monument, a machine. Initiate the collection sequence, Mako ordered, his voice betraying the first hint of strain, a hairline crack in his granite composure. The mission was no longer an abstract set of orders on a page. It was this humming, black geometry of alien stone. Roger. Powering up the loom, Stitch responded, his fingers flying across his console with irreverent precision. Resonance is locked. The field is coalescing. It's accepting the frequency. In the belly of the midnight bird, a device of Stitch's own design began to activate. The loom was not a mechanical claw or a magnetic grapple. It was an emitter of focused quantum fields, a tool designed not to touch the physical object, but to persuade its underlying quantum state to relocate. It was the most advanced piece of technology ever conceived by man, and it was being used to ask a polite question of an alien god. A low, harmonic tone joined the subsonic hum of the structure, a pure, clear note that seemed to calm the very air. From the underside of the bird, a shimmering, visible distortion in the air, a lens of bent light and warped space, extended downwards, like a funnel of solidified mirage, reaching for the black structure. The field is engaged, Stitch reported, his eyes wide as he watched the energy readings on his scopes. It's working. The asset is. It's phase locked. I'm initiating translation. The angular black form below them seemed to waver, like a reflection on disturbed water. It lost its solidity, becoming a ghost of itself, a sketch drawn in light and shadow. Then, with a silent, effortless motion that defied every law of physics they knew, the entire, immense structure dissolved into a stream of dark energy and was drawn up into the shimmering funnel. It flowed into the containment bay of the midnight bird like smoke into a bottle. The process was utterly silent. The deep, subsonic hum that had filled the valley for millennia simply stopped. The absence of sound was deafening. Below them, where the impossible structure had stood, there was now only a concave depression in the snow and rock, a perfect negative space that exactly mirrored the asset's form. The valley was just a valley now. Empty. Normal. Inside the bird, the only sound was the steady hum of their own systems. The loom powered down. The containment bay indicators showed a stable, secure load. They had done it. They had collected the asset. Mako let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He keyed the mic, the one connected to the long-range, high-frequency radio that was their only tenuous link back to the world they had left. Falcon to Nest. We have the package. The asset is secure. I repeat, the asset is secure. He released the button. The only response was the hiss of dead air. Not the active, malevolent silence of the distorted zone, but the empty, passive silence of a dead line. He tried again, putting more force into his voice. Nest, this is Falcon, do you read? Mission is a success. Awaiting further instructions. Nothing. Stitch checked the comms panel. The radio is functional. We're broadcasting. There's just no one answering. The three men sat in the suddenly fragile silence of their cockpit, hovering over the empty Arctic valley. They had just pulled off the most incredible intelligence coup in human history. They had retrieved an object of incalculable power and age. And the only people in the world who knew they had done it were no longer talking to them. HQ had gone dark. They were alone, carrying a slumbering god in their belly, with no orders, no destination, and no one to tell them what to do next. The most dangerous part of the mission had just begun. The silence in the cockpit was a physical presence, thick and heavy as wet wool. It was broken only by the steady, reassuring hum of the Midnight Bird's own systems and the frantic, shallow breathing of three men trying to process the void where an alien cathedral had once stood. The depression in the snow below was a fresh wound on the planet, a perfect, geometric scar that testified to the impossible thing they had just done. Nest, this is Falcon, do you copy? Over. Mako's voice was tighter now, the professional calm sanded away to reveal the raw steel of anxiety beneath. His thumb was pressed hard against the transmit button on the control yoke, his knuckle white. Nest, come in. Mission is successful. I repeat, the asset is secured. Awaiting extraction coordinates. Over. Nothing. Not even the whisper of solar static. The high-frequency radio, their one tenuous thread back to the world of men, was a dead wire. It was as if the entire United States military command structure had simply vanished from the face of the Earth. Stitch was a whirlwind of quiet activity at his station. Long-range comms are nominal. Power output is peak. The antenna is functional. It's not us. He switched bands, trying the emergency frequencies, the commercial aviation guard channel, anything. The speakers remained mute. It's like there's a blanket over everything, but the distortion field is gone. The physics here are normal. This doesn't make sense. Rook, from the rear, was staring at the containment bay indicators on his panel. A series of bar graphs and temperature readouts all glowed a steady, reassuring green. The package is stable. No energy fluctuations. No thermal bleed. It's just sitting there. Quiet. Too quiet, Mako thought. The absence of the structure's deep, subsonic hum was more unnerving than the sound itself had been. That hum had been a presence, a heartbeat. Now, there was only the vacuum it had left behind, and the chilling silence from HQ. They were alone in the most remote place on Earth, carrying the most dangerous secret in history, with no one to tell them what to do next. Maybe the extraction signal is compromised, Stitch suggested, a desperate hope in his voice. The event, the collection, might have emitted an EMP pulse we didn't anticipate. Fried their receivers. Mako shook his head, his eyes scanning the serene, star-dusted Arctic sky. They'd have contingencies, redundancies. This is a blackout. Deliberate. He ran through the possibilities, each more chilling than the last. Had the mission been compromised? Had the Soviets somehow detected them? Was HQ under attack? Or was this the ultimate deniability? They had the asset. They were the only loose ends. The thought was a sliver of ice in his veins. We can't stay here, Rook said, giving voice to the urgency they all felt. Fuel state is good, but we're a sitting duck. We need to move. Mako made the only decision he could. We go back. We follow the ingress corridor in reverse. Maybe comms will restore once we're back in the turbulence. He pushed the throttle forward gently, and the Midnight Bird began to climb, turning its nose away from the haunting emptiness of the valley and back towards the warped sky from which they had come. They had flown for less than 5 minutes when Stitch let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Mako, the bay, the containment field, it's fluctuating. Mako's eyes darted to his own secondary panel. The green bars representing the asset's stable state were now flickering, dancing between green and a cautionary yellow. A low-grade alarm, silent but indicated by a flashing light on the console, had activated. What's happening? Mako's voice was a razor's edge. I don't know. The field integrity is perfect. Power is steady. It's not the loom. Stitch's fingers flew across his keyboard, calling up a new set of diagnostics. It's the asset. It's doing something. It's initiating a state change. Before their eyes, the data on their screens began to rewrite itself. Schematics of the containment bay, which had shown a single, monolithic object, now displayed a complex, internal latticework of energy channels beginning to glow from within. The temperature readings, which had been a steady -50 degrees Celsius, the ambient temperature of the bay, began a slow, inexorable climb. Inside the specially shielded bay, the black, angular form of the asset was no longer inert. Without a sound, without a visible seam, sections of its impossibly smooth surface began to rotate, sliding past one another with a fluid, organic grace that defied the starkness of its geometry. Sharp angles recessed, new planes emerged. It was reconfiguring itself, unfolding like a black flower blooming in fast forward. From within the newly revealed apertures, a faint, internal luminescence began to pulse, a deep, bloody crimson that throbbed in time with a rhythm they could not hear, but could feel in the marrow of their bones. The pressure began to build inside the cockpit. It started as a faint buzz in the teeth, a vibration in the fillings, but it quickly intensified, pushing in on their eardrums, pressing against the backs of their eyeballs. It was not painful, not in a physical sense. It was something far more insidious. It was a presence, a consciousness, vast and cold and utterly alien, was stirring in the belly of their aircraft. It was waking up. And it was trying to communicate. The sensation was not of words, or images, or sounds. It was pure information, raw concept, being pressed directly into the neural pathways. It was a wave of data that felt like a migraine aura, geometric shapes, impossible angles, logarithmic spirals that conveyed meaning without language. A sense of immense, geological time. A feeling of cold, stellar loneliness. A map of cosmic voids and gravitational tides. And beneath it all, a single, overriding imperative that was less a command and more a fundamental rewriting of their own will. It was a sense of direction. Not a compass heading, but a deep, biological pull, an instinct as primal as a salmon fighting its way upstream. The structure was telling them where to go. My God, Rook whispered, his hands gripping the edges of his console. It's in my head. It's showing me stars. A different set of stars. Stitch had his hands pressed to his temples, his eyes squeezed shut. It's a coordinate. A location. Not on Earth. It's a transit point. A gateway. Mako fought against the tidal wave of alien thought, clinging to the wreckage of his own mind, his own mission. The pressure was immense, a psychic gravity trying to bend his intent. He could feel his hand on the control yoke being subtly influenced, a phantom pressure trying to turn him away from their homeward course, towards a new heading, one that felt both terrifying and irresistibly right. It was then that the radio crackled to life. The sound was explosive in the tense silence, a burst of static that made all three men jump. Then, a voice cleared its throat. It was a familiar voice. Calm, authoritative, laced with the subtle gravel of a 4-pack-a-day habit and a lifetime of command decisions. It was General Thorne's voice. Falcon, this is Nest. Acknowledge. Mako's heart slammed against his ribs. A wave of relief, so powerful it was almost nauseating, washed over him. They were back in contact. He keyed the mic, his voice rough with strain. Nest, Falcon, we read you. The asset is secure but it's active. I repeat, the asset is. We are tracking your status, Falcon, Thorne's voice interrupted, its tone flat, unnervingly calm. The package is nominal. Mako froze. The relief curdled in his gut. Nominal. The thing in their bay was unfolding like a nightmare origami and beaming star charts into their brains. That was not nominal. Sir, Mako said, fighting to keep his voice level. The situation is not nominal. We are experiencing psychological effects. The asset is emitting some kind of field, requesting immediate emergency landing instructions. There was a pause on the other end, filled only with the clean hiss of the open channel. Then Thorne's voice returned, its cadence exactly the same, the pauses in the same places, the inflection identical. The package is nominal, the voice repeated. And in that moment, Mako knew. He knew with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins. The radio signal was perfect. Too perfect. There was no lag, no distortion, no background noise from the Nest operations room. It was a pristine, studio-quality recording of Thorne's voice, being played back to them. But it wasn't coming from Nevada. He looked at Stitch, whose face had gone ashen. The systems officer had heard it too. The radio wasn't receiving a transmission, it was being used. The asset had accessed the comms, sampled a voice print from their mission logs, and was now speaking to them with the voice of their commander. Before Mako could form a response, the voice came again, Thorne's tone, but now laced with an undercurrent of something that was not human. A cold, galactic urgency. Leave, the voice said, the single word dripping with finality. Now. The moment the word was uttered, the psychic pressure in the cockpit vanished. The geometric visions snapped out of existence. The deep, throbbing crimson glow from the containment bay indicators faded back to a steady, dormant green. The asset had gone quiet. Its message had been delivered. There was no discussion, no debate. The command, delivered in the voice of their ultimate authority and reinforced by the alien will that had just gripped their minds, was absolute. It bypassed reason and lodged directly in the lizard brain. Obey. Mako slammed the throttle to the firewall. The Midnight Bird's nuclear thermal engine responded with a silent, savage surge of power. The force shoved them back into their seats. He didn't bother with a gradual climb. He pointed the nose towards the southern sky, towards the shimmering, distorted aurora that marked the boundary of the zone, and willed the aircraft to fly faster than it ever had before. They hit the distortion field like a bullet striking gelatin. The warped stars returned, smearing across the canopy. The aurora wrapped around them in a violent, silent embrace. But this time, they did not slow. They were fleeing. And then, the bird screamed. It was a sound of metal dying. A shrieking, grinding cacophony that tore through the airframe. Every light on the instrument panel, every single one, erupted in a frantic, blinding red blaze. Master caution. Engine fire. Hydraulic failure. Electrical failure. Cabin depressurization. The warnings clanged and buzzed in a deafening chorus of mechanical agony. The control yoke went dead in Mako's hands. It was no longer sluggish. It was a useless piece of metal. The stick in Rook's station was equally inert. The revolutionary fly-by-wire system had been utterly annihilated. The engine, piercing whine, faltered, coughed, and then fell silent. The hum of the reactors, the buzz of the electronics, the whisper of the climate control, it all died. The only sound was the shriek of the wind over a dead airframe and the frantic beating of their own hearts. They were now a 50-ton rock, falling out of the sky at the edge of space. "I've got nothing," Rook yelled, his hands scrambling over dead switches. "Total failure. Primary, secondary, tertiary, everything is gone. We're in a flat spin," Stitch shouted, watching the useless altimeters unwind in a dizzying blur. The Arctic landscape was spinning wildly in the canopy, a mad carousel of black rock and white ice. Mako fought the dead controls, his muscles straining, but it was like trying to steer a building. They were plunging, trailing smoke and pieces of shredded composite skin, towards the jagged teeth of the mountains below. This was it. This was the failure Thorn had warned them of. They would crash in this godforsaken place, and their bodies and their secret would be buried under ice for eternity. But the crash never came. The spin began to slow, not because of any control input, but as if a giant, invisible hand had reached out and gently stopped the mad rotation. The nose of the aircraft, which had been pointed at the ground, slowly, gracefully, leveled out. They were no longer falling. They were gliding. It was the most unnerving sensation any of them had ever experienced. There was no power, no control, no lift from the aerodynamically compromised wings. Yet the midnight bird flew on, perfectly steady, carving a smooth, silent path through the violently distorted air. It was as if the aircraft was locked onto an invisible rail, a groove in the sky that led home. "What the hell?" Rook breathed, his voice full of awe and terror. Stitch stared at his dark, dead screens. "It's not us. We're not flying." He looked out the canopy. The shimmering auroral tendrils were not just around them now, they seemed to be caressing the wings, guiding them, forming a tunnel of coherent energy through the chaos. "The air. It's flying us." Mako released the dead control yoke, his hands hovering uselessly. He was a passenger in his own aircraft. The feeling was one of absolute helplessness, mixed with a profound, humbling sense that they were in the care of a power that made their technology look like stone tools. The asset, or the intelligence that controlled this place, was shepherding them out. It had told them to leave, and it was ensuring they complied. For 20 minutes, the ghost flight continued. They sat in the eerie silence of the dead cockpit, watching the impossible landscape slide past. The warped stars began to straighten. The violent aurora faded to a gentle, green shimmer, then to nothing. The sense of psychic pressure and spatial distortion lifted, and as they crossed back into the clean, normal airspace over the Canadian archipelago, the midnight bird came back to life. It happened in an instant. The instrument panels flickered, then blazed with light, all the warning lights extinguished, replaced by a full suite of green indicators. The control yoke jerked in Mako's hands, once more a responsive, living thing. The engine spooled up with its familiar, resonant whine. The radios emitted a soft chime, indicating a restored link to navigation satellites. It was as if the last half hour had never happened. The aircraft was perfectly healthy, as if some divine mechanic had repaired all the catastrophic damage in the blink of an eye. Mako took the controls, his pilot's instincts kicking back in. He stabilized their flight, his mind reeling. He keyed the mic, his thumb hesitating for a fraction of a second over the button. Who, or what, would be on the other end? "Nest, this is Falcon, do you copy?" The response was instantaneous. It was a different voice this time, younger, laced with the crisp efficiency of a communications officer. There was no static, no lag. It was a perfectly normal radio transmission. "Falcon, Nest copies. Authenticate Sierra Victor 9er. Mako read the code from his sheet, his voice automatic. The authentication was confirmed. There was a brief pause, then the voice returned, its tone flat and final. "Message from command. Mission is aborted. Return to base. You were never there." The line went dead. Mako, Stitch, and Rook exchanged a long look. No questions about the asset. No demands for a mission report. No debrief. Just 3 simple sentences that erased everything. Aborted. Return. You were never there. They had done the impossible. They had touched the untouchable and brought a piece of it home. They had been mentally probed by an alien intelligence and flown home by a guiding hand from beyond human understanding. And the only response from their masters was to pretend none of it had ever occurred. Mako banked the aircraft towards the south, towards the remote airstrip they had left a lifetime ago. They were returning to a world that would never know what they had done, to a chain of command that would never acknowledge their existence. They were ghosts, returning from a haunted land, carrying a secret that was now a part of them, buried deep in the shielded bay of their aircraft and the scarred tissue of their minds. The flight back was smooth, the air calm. But inside the cockpit, the silence was louder than any explosion.